If I could invent a guest for this show, if I could create a person with a computer or an iPad app or a Tinker Toy set with a motor, if I could create the perfect person to discuss Haley Barbour's home cooking his own version of the civil rights movement and school desegregation in Mississippi to prep his likely presidential run in 2012 against Barack Obama, that guest that I invented would not be as good as the person at the other end of the satellite machine right now. She is Melissa Harris Perry, Associate Professor of Politics and African American Studies at Princeton and an MSNBC contributor. Melissa, thanks for joining us again.
Oh, absolutely.
Does Haley Barbour's magical mystery tour of desegregation and Mississippi in the 50s and 60s, does this lead us to Barack Obama versus Haley Barbour for the presidency in 2012?
I don't think so. You know, whether or not Haley Barbour becomes the GOP candidate is a long and tortured couple of years yet. We've got some time on that. But I do think that there are some real dangers here that we need to pause and be careful about. One is that someone who is being this extreme about race, and it really is extreme to be romantic about segregation and about Jim Crow, can make an awful lot of room for folks who have very similar policy ideas, but simply do a better job of talking race. And most clearly that is Mike Huckabee. So, you know, Mike Huckabee talks about race probably better than any other candidate in the 2008 elections. I mean, really only maybe Barack Obama during the Philadelphia speech and John Edwards with his Two Americas. But other than that, Mike Huckabee is kind of this straight-shooting Southern white man who can talk about racial history. The fact is, though, that when you looked at his policies in the contemporary moment, they are not that dramatically different than that of Haley Barbour's. And yet, my bet is that this kind of extremism on the right makes an awful lot of room for somebody like Huckabee to come right on through the center right.
Well, do you think it's sort of a deliberate effort to push the envelope, then, to try to make things that seem more extreme seem not as extreme? I mean, we've had the Confederacy commemorations without any mention of slavery. We've had the reanimation of secession as an idea in conservative politics. We've got, of course, Mr. Barbour saying, hey, I was there, Jim Crow wasn't so bad. Do you think this is on purpose to try to clear some racial space in national politics?
You know, I gotta say, I grew up in immediate post-segregation Virginia. I went to college and graduate school in North Carolina. I now make my home in Louisiana. And the fact is, I always have a little bit of tension when I start talking about Southern racial history, because there's a part of me that wants to not let the rest of the country off the hook on race. I mean, the fact is that segregation, particularly the use of private schools to flee from black children integrating into them, is certainly not an exclusively Southern activity. On the other hand, the reality is that in former Confederate states, where there was a secession from the United States, we allowed a revisionist history to enter in as quickly as a decade after the Civil War. And what we are seeing now is simply a reaping of that continual whirlwind of this kind of misguided history. I mean, I grew up in a school system that called the Civil War the War of Northern Aggression, or the war between the states. So it's not necessarily some sort of deliberate process. It is, in many ways, just the Southern way. I mean, Jim Crow wasn't that bad if you are the powerful, white, privileged school child. It in fact, maybe is sort of invisible how much suffering is occurring as a result of organizations like the Citizens Council.
How do you, and I realize this is not something that is new, and as you say, this is something that has to get fought over constantly, and sometimes it's won and sometimes it's lost, but the struggle never really stops on this. How do you prevent a memory hole, right, about something like Deep South segregation when I think the right clearly wants a fight over it? How do you avoid historical fact becoming just another contested partisan point that people have a he said, she said debate about?
And it is weird that they really do want to fight about it. I mean, it would be easy enough, particularly as Republicans, to say, oh, look, that was a time in our past. It's all over now, post-racialism. And by the way, that was the Democratic Party that was behaving that way. I mean, that is bad history, but it's, you know, it's pretty palatable. To instead want to actually go in and recover, revive, and tell us that this segregationist history is American and is is appropriate and is reasonable in our contemporary era. From my perspective, it really is a kind of, and I hate to use this word, it's a kind of existential anxiety. It is a fear that the country is going to be so fundamentally different because of the realities of census changes, because of the realities of power changes, because women and people of color and now gays in the military all have these sort of growing equal rights. The fact is, it's almost like there's just such fear to go back and claim these white supremacist moments as though they are what really represents America. So the thing that prevents the memory hole is that you fight back against those Texas and Arizona initiatives that start trying to strip ethnic studies from everyone from kindergartners to college students. The fact is, history, truth, and the American way, in a kind of Superman way, really are on our side here. If we just tell the truth, the fact is we beat this kind of rhetoric.
Melissa Harris Perry of Princeton University, an MSNBC contributor, thank you so much. I know you had to go a great distance from joining us at the 92nd Street Y to joining us from New Orleans tonight. I am even more grateful than I usually am, Melissa. Thanks.
Thanks. Happy holidays.
You too.